Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the PrimateCast. I'm your host, Andrew McIntosh, and the release date for today's podcast is Thursday, September the 11th, 2014. And we're moving on with installment 3 from our coverage of the 25th Congress of the International Primatological Society, which was held in Hanoi, Vietnam between August 11th and 16th of this year. Now, the theme for this installment is going to be primate conservation, which is always an important issue that comes up during primatological meetings. But having had the Congress this year in Vietnam brought that really close to everyone's attention, because Vietnam is a country that does have a lot of biodiversity of primates and endemic biodiversity of primates, but unfortunately many of those species are critically endangered or close to being critically endangered. And so the future of those species and populations is often quite in doubt. And so preserving primate biodiversity was an important theme for this year's Congress. So in this installment of the podcast, we're going to hear from primatologists and conservationists, including Tatiana Hummel, Miles Woodruff, Debbie Cox, Noel Rowe, and Augustine Bassa-Bose, talking about their roles and interests in the field of primate conservation. So in the first interview of this conservation installment, we're joined by Dr. Tatiana Hummel. Now, Dr. Hummel is lecturer at the Durrell Institute of Ecology and Conservation at the University of Kent. And it's notable that the graduate program that she's involved in, which is under the School of Anthropology and Conservation, provides quite a unique experience for its students. And because of the anthropological perspective they provide, this program includes a real focus on human factors in conservation efforts, which might be a little different from the more traditionally ecologically based conservation programs around the world. So in this interview, Dr. Hummel is going to talk about her work in conservation of West African chimpanzees, and specifically her perspectives on the role of sanctuaries in these conservation efforts and why landscape level investigations are extremely important to inform conservation management strategies to protect these animals. Now, we're going to just let this interview run from start to finish, and I apologize for the little background noise at the beginning. But here's Dr. Hummel telling us about her work.
Yeah, as a primatologist, I started studying chimpanzee culture and chimpanzees in West Africa, and after 20 years of working in country and in range state countries, I really noticed that we need to do much more sort of science that's applied for conservation. So I very much changed my focus to try and achieve mainly two things, and really addressing the main threats to chimpanzees in West Africa, one of which is the lack of law enforcement, the pet trade, and growing issues with negative interactions between people and chimpanzees, and also the big threat of increased development, large-scale development activities coming into these countries, whether we're talking about mining or potentially large-scale industrialized agriculture. So at that level, I see myself working, applying my knowledge, my skills in ethology and ecology, and employing interdisciplinary approach, also using social sciences to understand people, to try and bridge two levels. One is the continuum between conservation and welfare, and sort of bridging between these two worlds, whereby we need to acknowledge that chimpanzee sanctuaries, such as the Chimpanzee Conservation Center in Guinea or the Takogama Chimpanzee Sanctuary in Sierra Leone, are acting as major supporters of chimpanzee conservation efforts in country, not only taking in individuals of the pet trade and human-wildlife conflict issues, but also being quite active and active players in conservation as a permanent feature of the landscape in these countries. So basically is providing them assistance and expertise in trying to improve their practice, and also to allow to translate some of this scientifically to provide them with more credibility, and to allow them to kind of pursue effective strategies and conservation strategies. But another level, I'm interested more the landscape which integrates people, and trying to better understand the drivers of interactions between people and chimpanzees, and what are the sort of characteristics that generate tolerance or intolerance towards chimpanzees in different landscapes, and try to better understand those so we can prioritize areas where conservation efforts could be more effective or less effective. So moving really from a very grassroots conservation level at sanctuary level, at village levels, but also trying ultimately to better understand a landscape level in collaboration with other people who bring in different expertise, such as GIS expertise, economic expertise, social science expertise, to therefore better inform policy in terms of future oil palm development, mitigation of impact, mining industry, etc. So really it's sort of a very sort of encompassing approach, working with other people, using interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approach, and really to try and have a maximum impact on the conservation of chimpanzees in a region of Africa where chimpanzees live outside protected areas, and which still has a lot of potential lessons for application elsewhere across Africa as well, as we're seeing increased fragmentation of habitats, increased habitat degradation and deforestation in many areas, even in Central Africa. So this is sort of the core gist of my motivations and drivers as a scientist, as a conservationist, as someone who cares about people's livelihoods and cares about chimpanzee conservation and wildlife conservation more generally.
So that was Dr. Tatiana Hummel telling us about her work in the conservation of West African chimpanzees. In our next interview, we're going to chat with Miles Woodruff. Miles is a doctoral candidate at Durham University, working with Dr. Joanna Setchell, who we'll feature in a future podcast within this series. But he's also principal investigator on the Mandrill Reintroduction Project run by the Jane Goodall Institute. He's going to talk about that project and his research at Durham University. But before getting into that, he's going to tell us his interesting story about how he got involved in primate conservation.
I got into primatology in a bit of a roundabout way. I was in sustainable business, and I was into net impact and sustainable enterprise at various green MBA universities in San Francisco Bay Area. And I came into contact with Jane Goodall, and she encouraged me to explore primatology. Well, actually, at that point, I wasn't in sustainable enterprise. I was in a bit of exploitation. I was importing plastic. I was importing consumer goods and selling them to Walmart, and it didn't have a real strong conservation message. And I was explaining this to Jane Goodall, and she explained to me that I should take control of the situation and move into primatology, move into conservation directly. So I did. I set up with my business partner to sell my business and moved to a reintroduction project in the Congo, Help Congo. And I spent a year there with the chimpanzees doing field research. And after that, I shifted into sustainable enterprise. And I did 2 years of sustainable master's level business school. And then the Jane Goodall Institute asked me to come back and help them with the Mandrill Reintroduction Project.
Inspirational story there from Miles, so thanks for sharing that. And if you go back to the PrimateCast number 8, back in the archives, you'll see that we did an interview with Jane Goodall. And towards the end, when I asked what was next for her, she could say nothing more than, well, she just keeps going on because she makes a difference. And it's so clear that she does, the way she mentioned in the interview, but also Miles is another good example of that, of how her activities and people having the chance to meet her can be really inspirational and completely life-changing, as it seems to have been in this case. So in an unaired segment of the interview, Miles mentioned that this is a 4-year program and he is currently in the middle of that. And so using this Mandrill Reintroduction Project as a platform to launch his PhD research, which is focusing on the behavioral ecology of the mandrills to better inform conservation management strategies. Now, this is important because currently not a whole lot is known about mandrill behavior and ecology in the wild. They're currently listed as vulnerable on the IUCN Red List of threatened species. So the more information we have about this, the better the situation is going to be for them in the future. So before getting into details about Miles's PhD research, he's going to tell us first a little bit more specifically about the animals that he's working with.
My research is based on wild-born, captive-raised bushmeat orphans, mandrills, that have been confiscated in the Republic of Congo and are currently being housed at the Chipunga Sanctuary which is a JGI, Jane Goodall Institute-run sanctuary in the Republic of Congo. And so we get a number of mandrills right now. I think the total number is about 15 that we have. And we've released to date 7. And we're going to continue to release the other, probably 5 of them in the near future. Some of them aren't fit for the release necessarily, so they might have a long-term stay at the sanctuary. We don't want to just throw out every animal. We want to make sure that we're releasing ones that have a high probability of success.
So this issue of orphans of the bushmeat trade crops up all over the place, and going back to Jane Goodall's podcast, it was an important impetus for the Jane Goodall Institute's establishment of these sanctuaries in Africa. And even more recently, Joe Belitsky in the last podcast was talking about this issue as well, in terms of perhaps changing the way that we think about the management of those animals while before the reintroduction process occurs. But we asked Miles to tell us about what he will be focusing his research on during this project for his doctoral program.
It's reintroduction using mandrills as a case study. I have various components with various partners. So, for example, Disney is helping us with a fecal hormone cortisol metabolite study. And luckily, not luckily, we've just identified the biomarker we're going to use for that assay, which we presented in a poster here. And I'm also focusing on the function of GPS radio collars in the wild. There's evidence that collars function better in certain environments, and those environments aren't where monkeys live. So we're testing how well they work in certain environments and how that might affect your data. And I'm also presenting on that here at the conference.
So it looks like the pilots have been laid down for this particular research program, and it's nice to see Miles talking about the systematicity with which they wanted to test and make sure that their methods were appropriate, both in terms of the assays, the hormonal assays that they're going to use to estimate stress in the animals, and also the locational spatial data that they're going to be getting from the GPS units. Indeed, monkeys do not typically live where those things function at their best. So we wish Miles the best of luck with those programs. But we also wanted to get a little sneak peek at the results that he was presenting at this Congress. So that's what we asked him about next.
On the hormone study, like I said, we have found the assay we're going to use for that. It is a metabolite that we're going to be using to run all of the hormone study, because cortisol and corticosterone didn't give us the sensitivity we needed for that study. So it will be a metabolite, and we are going to be publishing that soon. And also for the collar study, we found that where the animals are in the forest definitely affects how the collars function. And also the animal's use of the forest affects how the collars function. And knowing how the collars function in your forest will affect the amount of noise that you have in your collar data. So it could show that a male was not in the area as the same area as a female if the male is terrestrial and the female is arboreal primarily. Like is the case in mandrills. The females and the juveniles are often foraging in the trees, and the large males are often on the ground. So their GPS data would be very different. So where they are in the forest introduces a lot of noise.
So that was Miles Woodruff telling us about his PhD research and the Jane Goodall Institute's mandrill reintroduction project. A little disconcerting at the end there about the dubious results produced by those GPS collars. So just a quick reminder that you are listening to the PrimateCast's coverage of this year's 25th Congress of the International Primatological Society, which was held between August 11th and 16th in Hanoi, Vietnam. Now in our third interview in this conservation installment, we're joined by Debbie Cox. So she spent the last 20 years working as a technical advisor for the Jane Goodall Institute, with a focus mainly on East Africa, but also in Central Africa's Congo Basin. And she's going to tell us first about the Jane Goodall Institute and its mission.
The Jane Goodall Institute has been doing conservation programs since 1986. Prior to that, the focus of the Institute was actually just supporting Gombe Stream Research Centre and the long-term study of chimpanzees at Gombe Stream in western Tanzania. But in 1986, Jane did a flyover, and it was for the first time that she really fully understood the impact of the human development around Gombe Stream and chimpanzees. And when she went to the Understanding Chimpanzee Conference in Chicago, she realised that what was happening in Tanzania wasn't in isolation, that it was happening everywhere across Africa, and that she needed to make a shift of what her focus was. And so she decided to leave the field, leave that in the hands of others, and become an advocate and fundraise to do conservation for chimpanzees.
So again, if you go back to our interview with Jane Goodall in podcast number 8, you'll hear that she does talk about this as well, how her activities were focused on the chimpanzees at Gombe and the research activities there. But then there was a meeting in 1986 in Chicago on Understanding Chimpanzees, where the actual conservation concern and threats to the animals really became apparent to her. And as she mentioned in the interview, she just came out of all of this an activist, and obviously a very good activist, who's had a very, very big impact around the world. Now, Debbie goes on to tell us here about the current strategies of the Jane Goodall Institute and where they plan to take their efforts in the coming years.
Just recently, the Institute has undergone a strategic planning for our chimpanzee conservation programs, and our target or focus is going to be trying to save in the next 30 years at least 85% of the chimpanzee populations. Of course, that's not something the Institute's going to do alone because we're a small organisation. We are hoping to form very strong collaborations with other organisations and leverage support to just work collaboratively together for a common cause, which is the protection of chimpanzees' habitat and chimpanzees themselves. At the moment, the Institute's focus is in Tanzania, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Republic of Congo. In Tanzania, of course, it's around Gombe Stream National Park and the Ugala Masitu area that borders on the Mahale ecosystem. In Uganda, of course, we work all over the western Ugandan forest zones. We there focus on at least 75% of the chimpanzees populations, but we are putting a lot of effort right now is on those chimpanzee populations that are actually outside the protected area system, because they create the corridors and the linkage between two large populations. So each of the populations inside the protected areas on their own are barely genetically viable, and so without the connectivity to the other populations, they would be at risk to extinction in the future. So that's where we put most of our focus. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, at the moment, our focus has been in eastern DRC on the Grau gorilla landscape, including, of course, the chimpanzees. We've been the coordinating NGO working with multiple NGO partners and government partners in stabilising the Grau gorilla landscape and trying to stop the killing of the gorillas and the chimpanzees in that area. It's a very difficult area to work because of the civil unrest, which is still, it's been going for more than 20 years now, and also just from a geographical point of view, because there's such low infrastructure that many of the forest zones and gorilla populations, chimp populations, it could be a 120-kilometre walk before you even get to them to even start actually doing survey work or protection work. And so it's a very challenging environment for us all to work in. The Congo Republic is a unique country in that fact that it has very intact habitat. The chimpanzee population is estimated around 20,000 chimpanzees. We have been there for the last 20 years. It's actually one of the countries that we've been in longest after Tanzania. And our main focus had always been actually just captive care of confiscated orphans, assisting the wildlife authorities in their law enforcement program. But right from the beginning, we also were involved in habitat protection with the Chimpunga Nature Reserve. And more recently, in the last 10 years, we've put a lot more focus on education and public awareness. And we've found some very interesting results, particularly with our public awareness. We've been focusing on roadside billboards, making sure that people understand what the laws are in the Congo and the protected status of the apes, and trying to create a sense of pride for the Congolese in having these apes in their countries, making them realise how special they are in the world to actually even have the two great apes in their country. We also, with that, have done a children's TV program called Super Kodo, which has been very successful. We've actually defined our success in the fact that we've been pirated and sold on the streets, even though it was a free TV program that we were giving out to the TV stations just to air for nothing. And this TV program uses a local boy, a child from our own staff, who gains special powers from a forest siren and goes around and saves wildlife and other animals, domestic animals, and also the environment. And his school friends help him do that as well. And so it's all done in local language and now a little bit more in French. And it's a very popular series. We're up to episode 14 now, and we even find adults watching it and commenting on that program, which is great fun. And we've seen from our results of our surveys with the people on the streets with the billboards that people are reading the billboards, and they have a change in attitude and also in practices. So prior to the billboards going up, when we surveyed the people on the street, we would do 100 people per town, and we do at least 10 towns. Nobody ever mentioned that a consequence of having a chimp or gorilla would be that you would go to jail. After the billboards went in, almost everybody would say you could go to jail. So we thought that was really good that people understood that. And to go alongside that is in the last year, we've only had one chimpanzee come into the sanctuary. Our average rate used to be 7 per year, and now to only have one. And last year we only had 4 chimpanzees come in, but of those 4, 2 of them actually we knew about at least more than a year earlier, but we had been waiting for the wildlife authorities to actually do an arrest, because that's one of the stipulations with ourselves now with the wildlife authorities, that for us to receive the chimpanzee, they have to actually arrest the person. They can't just go and take the animal and then bring it to us and there's no consequence to the person who had the chimp. And that seems to be, the word is getting out, and I think people are much more concerned now of the consequences of their actions, and so we're definitely seeing a very big downturn in the trade in chimpanzees in the Congo Republic.
So that was Debbie Cox, technical advisor with the Jane Goodall Institute, telling us about their activities. And we do hope with their public awareness campaigns that those trends of reduced numbers of chimpanzees coming into Congolese sanctuaries will continue in the long term. Would be a really nice sign of the success of those activities. And just momentarily, I'd like to go back to the other educational programs they have, producing children's books to raise awareness in children and educate children about the ongoing struggles of wildlife in their local areas. And it reminded me a few years ago in 2010 when Alison Jolly was given the Lifetime Achievement Award by the International Primatological Society. And during her acceptance speech, she actually read from one of her stories about lemurs. And so that was another big part of her work, not only just the research, but the really sincere and dedicated activities that she put into conservation and raising awareness about the plight of the lemurs in Madagascar and biodiversity in general. So that was a really nice and touching moment during that 2010 conference, which occurred in Kyoto. And so I think that these types of programs can really do a lot of good around the world, starting people really young. And of course, kids, we're at that age, we're always going to be so fascinated with the natural world. And so just tapping into that can have real power. So we wish Debbie Cox and the Jane Goodall Institute the best of luck in the future. In the fourth interview in this installment of the Primate Cast, we sat down with Noel Rowe. Now, many of you will know that name as the author of that iconic book, The Pictorial Guide to the Living Primates. But also, Noel is the founder and director of Primate Conservation Incorporated. So for any field workers out there, particularly those who work on endangered species of primates, may have come across that organization as in the context of trying to receive funding for their projects. I myself was on a project as a young graduate student from the University of Calgary working with Pascal Sicat on the West African black and white colobus monkeys in Ghana. And so we received some support from that organization as well. Now, he's also managing editor of the All the World's Primates project, which is kind of picking up where the pictorial guide left off. He's going to start this interview by talking about his work through Primate Conservation Incorporated.
My conservation work with Primate Conservation is to give grants to study and protect the least known and most endangered primates in the world in their natural habitat. So what we've done over the last 21 years is to give small grants and matching funds to primate field workers and conservationists in 29 countries. We've given money to over 500 projects, probably I think $1.2 million at this point has gone to primate protection and study. We have 2 granting periods in September and February. If you go to www.primate.org, you can find out much more information about who we've supported or get the application materials.
So Primate Conservation Incorporated doing great work for studying conservation of primates, particularly endangered primates around the world. So please do check out that website, see what you can do, and take a shot at a grant. So Noel's going to go on here telling us about his other activities in primate conservation, beginning with the All the World's Primates project.
My other job in primates is to finish the All the World's Primates book. We already have a website, All the World's Primates, smallcase.org. And this is a compendium of information based on a database, so it can be queried. It has information on life history, diet, physical measurements, conservation threats, behavior, of course, the taxonomy, and I think a couple of other categories of information. It has video, it has photographs, it has audio if we can find it. So you can hear gibbons sing, you can see Indries singing in video. All these charismatic species. It's based on the work of over 200 primatologists who are experts in their field. Most of them have studied the primates in the wild that they contributed the information for. And so it is up to date with the taxonomy, and the references are somewhere over 10,000. So it's a reference for more serious. Anybody could use it and be interested in it, but it's really a reference for students interested in primates, either undergraduate or graduate. They will find it the most useful.
Indeed, an incredible resource they're building from Noel and All the World's Primates. I had a chance to look at the website, and though it is subscription-based, I don't think any of us would feel too much pain donating to Primate Conservation Incorporated and supporting that cause. And it is just a nominal fee, so $40 US dollars for a lifetime membership actually gives you all the access you could need to all the world's primates. So do check that out, support the website and the program, and happy surfing about primates. Now in the next segment, Noel's going to tell us about different versions of All the World's Primates that are starting to come out or have started to come out in ebook format.
We also are working on, we have 2 ebooks now, one for the lorises, the lemurs, lorises, patos, and galagos, which is available on Amazon. And it's so that you can take the information with you on your phone or your iPad or whatever device you would like to have it. It works as any ebook does. We also just came out with the All the World's Apes ebook. which just has all the apes, but it has all the subspecies and the species, and even one form that's not a subspecies but is a population that was in the literature a lot, and so we cleared up that it's a not a valid subspecies, but it's an interesting population that has interesting behavior. We will hope to have all the world's African primates done by the end of 2014, and the All the World's Primates book by 2016 which will be the Chinese New Year of the monkey. So you can have a primate book and a monkey in the year of the monkey.
So really cool stuff there, great reference material, and I'm sure that we're all really looking forward to 2016 when that All the World's Primates complete volume will be available. Now, in the last segment of the interview, I could not let him go without being able to talk to us about that earlier book, The Pictorial Guide to the Living Primates, which was so inspirational probably for so many of us, and in many cases our first introductions to the great diversity that we see in primates around the world. And by the way, that diversity just continues to grow with the current number of species that some scientists are recognizing, over 600 now. And so Noel's going to talk a little bit about that, but also the history of how that book got started, where it came from, and what he managed to do with it.
I was the author in 1996 of the Pictorial Guide to the Living Primates, which started when I was taking graduate courses at the University of Stony Brook, I think it's Stony Brook University now. And I took the courses, and they kept referring to all these primates, and I said, well, yeah, but what do they look like? And there was nothing but one book that had mostly black and white pictures and had just a few species. And I went to my professor and said, I came up with a mock-up of a page and said, what do you think of this? And she said, this was Patricia Wright, who said, yes, you should do that. That's what the field needs. We really need that book. And so 5 years later, I finally finished the book and got it published. And the Pictorial Guide to the Living Primates was once referred to me as the Monkey Bible, and at the time it had all the primates in the world except for a few Aotis night monkeys, but there were only 234 species back then, and at the IPS, which we're at the moment, there are now 497 primates, I think, are recognized, and there's a few more that are about to be described. So it will be over 500 species included in the new book, The All the World's Primates, which has complicated the task no end, because they keep finding new species, they keep elevating subspecies to species, and we've changed taxonomies 3 times in the last 10 years trying to finish this book. But it will get done, and they may still find a few more species, but if we have 500, that'll be good enough.
So that was Noel Rowe, founder and director of Primate Conservation Incorporated, managing editor of the All the World's Primates Project, and the author of the Pictorial Guide to the Living Primates. And despite the increasing workload that Noel and others are receiving with the increased diversity of primates, the continuing increased diversity of primates, we're really glad to have people as dedicated as him that will just get on with it and keep producing great material for all of us to enjoy and find extremely useful in the future. So the 5th and final interview that we'll feature in this, our conservation-themed installment of our coverage from the 25th Congress of the International Primatological Society, will be with Dr. Augustine Basabose. Now, Dr. Basabose is a primatologist from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where he works at the National Center for Scientific Research of Luiro, and as well as a number of local and regional universities that he teaches and mentors at, including notably the University of Bukavu, and more recently, an upstart university called the University of Saint-Quentin, where he's expected to assume the role of dean of a faculty related to biological sciences in the near future. So Dr. Basabose joined us on the podcast to talk about his research and conservation efforts in the Kahuzi-Biega area of DRC, a field site that has been run by the now president of Kyoto University, Professor Juichi Yamagiwa, who's been there for over 2 decades now, and they've been collaborating on that project ever since. So in the beginning of the interview, Dr. Basabose is going to start by telling us a little bit about their research activities and findings concerning chimpanzees and gorillas in the area.
I'm studying ecology of chimpanzees and gorilla, great apes. Those two subspecies, actually it's Eastern lowland gorilla and Eastern chimpanzees. They coexist in the mountain forest of Kahuzi-Biega, which is a unique site actually, where both subspecies, gorilla Beringia graueri and Pan Troglodytes schwanenfurti, inhabit sympatrically in mountain forests. This is a unique site in the world where both subspecies share the same habitat. So the habitat is quite mountainous, as I was saying, but the other particularity is there are less fruits when you compare with other forests, like lowland forests. I'm emphasizing on fruit because this is a major food for both chimpanzees and gorillas. So basically, we want to have a big picture and to understand how these two subspecies can survive together in a habitat where food is limited food. So as you can expect, they might have competitions over food, but this is not the case because each subspecies developed a kind of niche. So there is a kind of niche separation between, so they can live together. So chimpanzees, I'm already on the result. So chimpanzees only focus on eat fruits, and gorillas mainly eat herbs, which is quite different from West lowland gorilla, where they are frugivorous. Somehow they have frugivorous diet, but eastern gorillas, and especially the eastern lowland gorilla, is frugivorous, of course, but sometimes they do eat fruits when fruits are available. But what happens when fruit is available and when they shift from frugivorous diet to frugivorous diet as chimpanzees? What we observe is there is no competition at all when both subspecies meet on a fruiting trees. We observe very interesting phenomena, and the gorillas is supposed to be strong, and chimpanzees supposed to fear gorillas, but basically it's not the case. Yes, what happens when gorillas approaches feeding trees where chimpanzees are eating, they observe a kind of distance, but they show up their presence so that chimpanzee can recognize they are around. And what we observe, chimpanzee leave earlier the trees and go, a kind of leaving a room for gorillas. Yes, but gorillas do not attack. There is a tolerance when it comes on for food. That's what we observed. Really, it's interesting, and we believe there are so many things to observe to justify why those two subspecies are living together in a mountain forest, as I told you, which is characterized by less fruits.
I think it's quite fascinating to think about these two great ape species coming into contact in these potentially competitive scenarios where they may be challenging each other over specific food resources in such a food-limited environment, as Dr. Basabose explained. And I really love the way he explains this. It just kind of brings this scenario to life, even though in the end it's often seemingly more common that nothing actually comes out of that and they just go off their separate ways. But later in the interview, in a part that we won't air here, Dr. Basabose did mention that in the area there are a number of chimpanzee communities, 3 to be exact, and numerous gorilla groups. Within their specific heavily or intensively studied study site, there's 1 chimpanzee community and 2 gorilla groups, and with a heavily overlapped set of home ranges. And so you can imagine that these kind of events would occur not infrequently. But of course, what we also have to remember is that not only are these great ape species overlapping in their home ranges, there are also local humans in the area. And so inevitably, that's going to cause some conflict. So we wanted to get Dr. Basabose's perspective on the human primate, human and non-human primate interface there, the conflicts that arise, and what they're doing on the ground to kind of mitigate some of these.
Yes, we are interested in conservation, of course. Yeah, our project, which is led by Professor Juchi Amagiwa from Kyoto University, our project has good collaboration with local communities. Especially, there is a local NGO interested in conservation. Of course, also in human livelihood. So we support them. We support the idea, and actually sometimes we work together, and we provide advices when it's needed. Normally, people around Kahuzi Biega don't eat chimpanzees and gorillas. It's a taboo. I mean, part of the people. There is another side where chimpanzees and gorilla are food for them. But in the side where we are working, they don't eat actually, but they set snares to catch antelopes, and sometimes gorilla may be caught in their snares, and so there is a pressure on the wildlife because it's an area where we have a high population density. Sometimes it can reach 1,000 people per square kilometer. You can imagine what pressure there is on the wildlife. And the majority of people are poor. They believe all resource should come from the park. So there is a much pressure. Even if they don't eat on daily basis, I mean, in the gorillas and the chimpanzees as bushmeat as food, but there is other pressure on firewood collection, sometimes illegal mining, and as I said, poaching duikers, and since duikers are sharing the same habitat with the gorilla and chimpanzees, so the great apes are also affected by this poaching behavior. Yes, so there is a pressure and there is a threat on the gorillas, but also there is another threat is, as I said, there is a high population density around Kahuzi Biega National Park, which means population are very close to the park. There is the park boundary. There is no buffer zone. So sometimes gorilla and chimpanzees leave the forest to raid crops in peasants' fields, and it brings the conflict between local people and the park. That's effectively the role of the NGO, the local NGO, trying to educate people the importance of gorillas and chimpanzees. But as I was saying, there is a kind of conflict because the crops are being, so it brings some conflict. But yes, the Popov, because we are talking about the local NGO which called Popov, is doing a great job. trying to present itself as a bridge between the people and the park. So, educate, as I'm saying, and support some small activities which can help people so that they increase not only the awareness, but they get some benefits, and of course the awareness as well, so that they know it's really very important to protect the gorillas and chimpanzees. And so awareness, yes, but as you know, people, as said, they are very poor, they lack everything, and all the resources they have to collect inside the park. So what we normally do as researchers, we support such kind of NGOs which can work directly with the people to provide other alternatives, so people somehow they increase their livelihood and reduce the pressure on the park resources.
So there's really no substitute for capacity building in any successful conservation effort, and Dr. Basabose touched on that later in ways that these local NGOs can help improve the livelihoods of local communities, which then reduce their reliance on products from the forest and infringing on great ape habitat. But also another important component of that is having good people on the ground and having educated people on the ground. And Dr. Basabose himself is a great example of this. So obviously a very dedicated researcher and conservationist in the area. And he's had a long history of interaction with Japanese primatologists and even spent some time at Kyoto University getting his PhD there. So he wanted to leave us here at the end of the interview just with a brief message, kind of expressing his thanks and the importance that having had that opportunity to come to Japan and study in Japan had on his future career.
My work with gorilla and chimpanzee led me to go to Japan, and I was lucky. In 2005, I presented my PhD. I got my PhD from Kyoto University, and under the supervision of Professor Juichi Yamagiwa. And recently, last year, I was invited by Professor Tetsuro Matsuzawa to join the PWS, whereby I'm an international collaborator. I'm very happy with that position. And even now, I'm here on invitation by Professor Tetsuro Matsuzawa to join this IPS. Thank you very much.
And a big thanks back to Dr. Basabose for joining us on the podcast. Now, towards the end of the interview there, he did mention this PWS program, and I should just clarify, we talk about it in the introductory podcast to this IPS series, but I'll just reiterate that stands for Primatology and Wildlife Science, which is a new graduate program, a leading graduate program launched this year by Kyoto University, accepting graduate students into a program that's, of course, designed to produce scientists and particularly field researchers, but moreover to produce individuals who have extra skills in conservation and outreach activities, for example. And so Dr. Basabose has been invited into the extended international network of collaborators that are working together to make this program happen and to provide different outlets and different networks for students involved in the program to get some more diverse training opportunities or field research opportunities. And so for anyone interested, you can go to the website. You can Google that, Kyoto University's Primatology and Wildlife Science, or go through the SciCasp webpage. We have links in our program page, but do check that out. So I'd like to thank all of the guests we had on this podcast, on this conservation-themed podcast of our coverage from the 25th Congress of the International Primatological Society in Hanoi, Vietnam. That included Tatiana Hummel, Miles Woodruff, Debbie Cox, Noel Rowe, and Augustine Basabose. So that is going to do it for this episode of the PrimateCast. I hope everyone enjoyed our interviews today, and do stay tuned for our next podcast when we're going to feature a host of very well-known primatologists, including Augustine Fuentes, Cheryl Knott, Elisabetta Wieselbergi, James Hyam, and Joanna Setchell. Until then...
You have been listening to the PrimateCast, a podcast series dedicated to the study and conservation of primates around the world. brought to you by the Centre for International Collaboration and Advanced Studies in Primatology of the Primate Research Institute of Kyoto University. Visit us online at www.cicsp.pri.kyoto-u.ac.jp/news/podcasts and follow us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/thePrimateCast and on Twitter